attends these meetings and who does a quick roll call. So Christian's here, Jonathan's here. Anybody else?
Actually, I'll start being at these meetings regularly also.
Oh, is that Mike? Yeah. Hello, sir. Anyone's? I just did a kind of a sweep of the attendee list before the meeting. So if I deleted anyone who's actually here now, please just add your names. That's fine. Deepak's here, I see. Irfan, Quinton's here. Shashi, I think you're here. Looks like it. Red Hat, just shout if we're doing that. Is Maru here? Yes, he is. Scott. Delete Scott. Yes. Ivan, can I delete Ivan?
Oh, Ivan's here.
Cool. Paul Marie, is he here? Delete him for now. I can. No. Lindsay Tullo.
Yeah,
no.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, hello. Excellent. The OPA guys, Torrin, is he still attending today? Dan, I think I saw you there. Oh, Dan.
Yep, I'm here.
Canonical Konstantinos and Steen, either of them here today? Okay, I'm just going to remove them. Microsoft, I don't think Jace is around. CoreOS, anyone from CoreOS here?
Ryan's here.
Thanks, Ryan. And whoopsie. eBay, Ashwin, is he here or anyone else from eBay?
Nope.
Okay, right. So we have a reasonably up-to-date list now. Cool. So I put a basic agenda together based on what I know to be going on and some requests that have been made as to things. Please add to it as we go if you remember anything new. Otherwise, I'm just going to walk through it and we can talk about it along the way. So the multi-cluster workgroup discussion has not made significant progress in the last couple of 2 weeks. There was an auth meeting with the SIG auth guys discussing how to progress and some provisional decisions were made, and that needs to be documented. That's on my head, as is the API rework, but there's not a lot of kind of finalized stuff to share with the group there yet. Those items. Okay, there were a few requests for update stroke design review topics. Morgan mentioned that he would like to talk about cluster IDs.
Yeah,
I think,
I don't know if he's online. I worked with him this week.
Okay, maybe we'll
work with him this week.
Cool, carry on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, just echo going on. He put together the document. This is an idea that's been floating around for a long time, that every cluster should have its own unique identifier. It has merit within the context of cluster registry, or rather within the context of people who would want to use the cluster registry. Morgan works for Service Catalog, and he has a need for it there. I don't know if it's an IBM need or not, but it's not really relevant because I'd also add that we talk to customers who routinely develop their own Kubernetes-based tools, and they have a need for basically what I would call a who am I feature because they clone the tool in many different clusters, and at some point they have to answer that question programmatically, and there is no way to do that. So what that document has is a series of various ways that we could insert a cluster UID into the cluster. Customers that I've spoken to just have deployed a config map in a known namespace that they like. But here there's, I think, 6 different ideas. You can come up with your own. The issue that is linked has about 250 comments, so it's one of those that has so many opinions, nobody can drill down and select one. So I proposed to Morgan that he bring this up in 1.9 as a feature of 1.9 because it is a user visible feature, and hopefully accompanying the document, turning the document into an actual design associated to that feature in the feature repo issue should help us deliver something known as a cluster UID for 1.9.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, this topic came up at SIG architecture as well. I don't know if anyone else was present, and there was quite a bit of discussion around it. If I can try and summarize there, and it's probably in the SIG architecture notes, there did not seem to be a lot of support for the idea of a kind of unified cluster ID, because many of the use cases have different sets of requirements, and it's not clear that having a single concept is useful. And as you pointed out, coming to some kind of agreement on what exactly that should look like looks very difficult. So I think for the service catalog use case, the conclusion was, use a config map, and that is the cluster ID specifically for the purpose of the service catalog. And anybody else who has a need for a cluster ID can decide to use that one if it fulfills the requirements, or can define a different one, because they presumably therefore have different set of requirements. And then at some point in the future, we can try and come up with a slightly more unified one. But together and saying that in order for my feature X needs a cluster ID to work, I also need, feature Y, which uses that cluster ID to be present, seemed like a bad idea. So these are not my opinions. These are basically what came out of SIG architecture, which I happen to agree with.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the X depended on Y comment.
Sorry, you broke up a bit there, Christian. Say again.
I said, I don't understand that when you brought up something in the context of it's not desirable to have a feature X depend on a feature Y. Are you still there?
Sorry, I'm going to see if I can fix my connection here because I seem to have one. Let me turn off my video and see if that helps.
Okay, well, I don't think it's useful to debate the discussion of architecture in this meeting, but clearly we have a common need.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, to clarify my comment, there was a question around who exactly decides what the cluster ID is, and at what point does it get decided, and whatever the data store is that stores that cluster ID, and that seemed to kind of imply some dependency chain where, if something other than your system decides what the cluster ID is, you need to have that thing installed. Otherwise, there won't be a cluster ID. If that happens, you have to kind of mirror it in multiple different installation processes, and there isn't a standard one. So there was a whole discussion around how many dependencies do we want to add to the system on this universal cluster ID. And I guess the conclusion was, if you want one, put it there and then rely on it. And there shouldn't be any cross dependencies in that case.
No, with a simple solution of just having an API that has, metadata about the cluster is just a non-starter, and config maps are the only option.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were two issues, and I don't want to kind of rattle too much on this topic maybe, but the two that came up were, who decides what the cluster ID is and populates it, and secondly, thing, because there's cases and they all seem to have, it's difficult to come across a small canonical set of user requirements for this cluster ID, and so trying to decide on what that was seemed not worth the trouble.
Okay. I think there's a few ways around this that are documented in the in what Morgan put together. So maybe add comments there, and that'll show up. It'll eventually be linked in the feature repo. But yeah, I don't think we can spend more useful time on the topic here at this time.
Yeah, I agree. And I should go and refresh my memory as well. Jonathan, I think you want to give us an update on the cluster registry, API, etc.
Yes. So a few weeks ago, we created a new k/repo Kubernetes/cluster registry, which was meant to be where we pulled the cluster controller code out of Federation into so that we could sort of get bootstrap and start working on the cluster registry. Over the past few weeks, I have been working on pulling code out of Federation and modifying it so that it has the basics of the cluster registry API. I've reached the point now where there is a cluster registry API server that can be run in a cluster, and you can do CRUD operations against a cluster object that has, at this point, no API fields, still pending some decisions on the cluster registry API doc, and also as a tool repurposed from KubeFed, which you can use to install a cluster registry into one of your clusters. At this point, as far as I know, most of the Kubernetes repositories get a lot of the bots and such by default. At this point, there really are only unit tests. I am considering this week going and attempting to set up a proud job that can run these just so that it exists before it's necessary and before the testing infrastructure is too complex. But at this point, there's a working prototype which I plan to add the rest of the fields from the cluster registry API as it exists more or less now in the doc, and then to add in the authentication and authorization, the auth info changes as those come up, as we discuss those with SIG auth and with people who have requirements around those fields.
Regarding getting the bots and stuff in place, have you talked to Test Intro about that?
I have. So
okay, cool.
I have. So the general, all Kubernetes repositories have bots enabled by default for things like LGTM and such. Those run, I think, on all Kubernetes repositories, and there's a set of plugins that do. For the actual continuous integration and PR pre-submit jobs, those require more scaffolding. It's not immediately clear to me how to set those up in a non-Kubernetes k/k repo or for a non-k/k repo, and whether, like, which parts of it seems like it's set up to be able to do this for repos that are not k/k, but I'm not sure if there are dependencies or just assumptions that have been made that may not work in this context. Because I'm not sure how many repos, there's a few other repos other than k/k that have PROW-based testing. I don't intend to set up a submit queue at this point because it seems to be getting ahead of it ourselves, and I think very few of the repos in k/k actually have submit queues set up. That seems like something that would be worthwhile when the actual work of merging PRs manually becomes too much of a burden and there are issues with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just a quick question. You mentioned that you stuff out of the Federation control plane code. So is the plan to, so have you just duplicated, pulled it out and shared both use, or what is the kind of end game for the cluster registry versus the Federation control plane? Like, how do they interact? Do they share code, or are they completely independent copies of the same code that diverge over time?
So I believe this is something that we will have to address going forward. I think at this point, the question, I guess the question I have, and I'm not sure of the answer, is will the Federation control plane use the same API as the cluster registry for clusters? So will the Federation control plane, I guess you'd say, migrate to using the API provided as the cluster list API for doing stuff with Federation. I think if that's the case, then Federation should potentially be able to use the cluster registry code more or less as is by vendoring it in. In fact, it may even be able to use it as a delegated or an aggregated API server within the Federation API server. Then, of course, building its own controller on top of that. Since the cluster registry does not actually have an active controller, it's really just an API server with storage.
Okay, that makes sense. But
Yeah,
right now, they're two separate code bases that can diverge unless we do something active to prevent them from diverging.
Yes, they are two separate code bases that can diverge.
Okay, I think that's fine as long as we're clear on where we are, and presumably as soon as the cluster registry kind of stabilizes and we decide that it is, you know, alpha or beta or whatever, then we can make the necessary changes in the Federation code base so that it uses that thing rather than having a divergent code base.
Yes, that's I would like that as well. I think it definitely makes sense to not have multiple versions of the clusters API. But I think that also, yeah, I agree that makes sense, but I think it's good also not to tie our hands and force them to be the same in case, I think until I mean, if the cluster registry API cannot work for Federation, then I think that is potentially a problem, but I'm not 100% certain yet that the cluster registry API will work for Federation perfectly as is. And so we can, I think, cross that bridge when we come to it.
I guess I would suggest that the criteria for cutting over would be not GA or some sort of release status, but merely feature parity.
That seems reasonable. I mean, the bit of Federation that is being replaced, which is the cluster. So I think once the API can represent, so in that case, you'd say once the API of the cluster registry can represent all of the features, all of the information that can be represented in the current Federation cluster API, then we should make the switch. And once, of course, the cluster registry is functional and verified. Does that seem okay?
And I mean, I don't think we would want to be making any radical changes to anything in Federation without considering the consequences of potentially making it harder to cut over. Like essentially, I would say a feature freeze on that. And it doesn't seem like a hard thing to do because we don't really touch that very much. At least we haven't historically. And if we're going to touch it a lot in the future, maybe we could just hold off a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Cool. Yeah, I think there are currently some fields in the Federation cluster object that don't necessarily have first-class representations in the cluster registry API. Some of these, I think, they have sort of similar concepts that have been potentially represented slightly differently. But there are certain things like, I believe the Federation, there's an idea of secrets in the Federation API, which I guess is a specific version of auth info. But at some point, someone I think will have to sit down and look at those.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
And understand how exactly they map to each other, which no one has.
Yeah.
We have not done that yet.
So I think I like Maru's idea that we are looking at feature parity and not exactly API complete compatibility. Is that what we just agreed for GA?
Well, suggested.
Well,
there wasn't anybody disagreeing.
My opinion would
That's why
be
I'm bringing it
that
up. I want to make sure.
my opinion would be that you know, we're in the process of what we believe will be the the beta API for Federation, and in amongst that maybe changes to the current cluster registration API. And once we have finalized that, I don't think we want to make interim changes like go from the current implementation we have of the Federation cluster API to one based on the current registry, and then make another change to the beta version of the Federation API. So I think we should interim stage and do whatever we need to do to implement the beta version of the Federation cluster API on top of the cluster registry. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that seems reasonable enough to me.
Cool. Should we move on? Any more comments about cluster registries and cluster APIs? Question about decomposition or composition of API servers, managers, etc.
It's a kind of a minor point, but whether we, I mean, currently we're just bundled in, the servers are just bundled with Hypercube. And the question I had was, do we want to create a federation like server binary and equivalent image, or do we actually want to separate the API server from the controller manager? I'm assuming the former, but I just wanted to double check.
I'm not aware of any change what we currently have. It's consistent with the default Kubernetes distro, I believe, and I'm not aware of any major problems with it. So if don't break what ain't broken, or don't fix what ain't broken. But if there are, yeah.
It kind of
I think Maru's, yeah, Madhu, go on.
No, go ahead. You have more context about this. I think the only point I wanted to say was I think it will get broken when you move things out of the core repo. So yeah, it's not like it's in unbroken state right now. It's going to be broken very soon.
Correct.
We know that it gets
Maru's point, I think, was more in context of where the things are moving now. So when you have a separate repo and then you probably are cutting out a release from there, then how exactly do we want to do that? So I think we will still have to have some binaries released. So his question probably points down more as it will be Hypercube bundled binary, or it will be only separate binaries. So that is some suggestion we can get from this meeting.
And if anybody has any backstory on why like Hypercube was chosen as kind of the primary means of distribution, I mean, I know you can certainly build whatever you want, but it seems like upstream cube, you deploy Hypercube. And I think that's kind of following in OpenChef's footsteps. I think the advantage of that approach is that you make sure that you don't skew. If you have the server components, they're all the same version. They're not like, oh, I have version this and here, and I have version this for this component. The downside being, if I want to be able to use just a part of it, I got to take the whole thing. I'm not sure that's the problem with Federation, because you're not going to use API without controller manager.
I can add more context to why we did that, because I did that. So initially, in the very first release of Federation, which was Q 1.3, we did have separate binaries for Federation API Server and Federation Controller Manager. But the problem was our build mechanism, build scripts, built the binaries, and then built the Docker images for those binaries in a tarball format, and then distributed both. And because this is Go, and the binaries are like these mega gargantuan binaries, which are like 5,000 megabytes, distribution size like just was like too big. So there was this whole thing to reduce, like Joe Bida started an initiative to reduce the distribution size. And as part of that, all the binaries which were shipping independently started linking to Hypercube binary, because there is very little cost to link to an already existing binary than shipping a separate binary. So we decided to link Federation binaries into Federation code into Hypercube binary, and hence also be part of the Hypercube image. But now that that won't be a problem if we distribute independently. We could separate things from Hypercube binary.
Well, I think the idea is that whether we want to have a monolith, well, whether we just want like a server binary, or do we want an API and a controller manager binary and have them be separate? I'm assuming we want to have just them to be together, but it sounds like that's not clear cut. I don't know. I was hoping this is going to be a simple yes, yay, or nay, not a technical discussion. But
can you guys hear me okay? I'm getting slightly broken up signal from Maru.
You're kind of on and off.
We could hear him okay.
Okay, my apologies. I was just going to make a comment that it seems like we have kind of two orthogonal discussions here. One is, are the Federation binaries and are the multiple Federation binaries separate from each other? And my straw man proposal would be that we're going to have separate, a different release cycle. We've got a different repository, etc. So separating the Federation binaries from the Kubernetes binaries seems like the answer is yes.
Yeah, that's a given. The question was not if we're going to do that. It was more like,
we want to separate. And then do we want to separate the multiple Federation binaries from each other? And my straw man would be, I haven't heard any strong reasons to do so. In fact, we used to do it in the past, and we reversed that decision for a bunch of reasonably valid reasons, and Kubernetes did much the same thing. So unless somebody has a good reason to do that, let's just leave it that way.
Yeah, I guess my question
Federation.
Sorry, Clinton. If we were to do that, would we end up with versioning, SKU, packaging pieces inside the Federation binaries? If we're thinking of the user, do we really want the user to be managing different binaries and making sure that they're all working together? Or do they just want to say, I want Federation, give me the whole piece? That would lend me to believe.
That's exactly what I'm proposing, which is that it is the whole piece. And that's what you get, but it's separate from the Kubernetes. So Kubernetes has a binary, and it has its API server and its bits and pieces in there. And then Federation has a binary which includes both the API server and the controller manager to install and upgrade in your Federation control plane. That's a proposal. I'm not saying that's what we have to do. That's what we essentially do today. I haven't heard any reasons not to do that. The only reasoning I have heard is to separate our binaries from the Kubernetes binaries, and I think that's sort of implicit in the switch to a new repo and a different release cycle.
correct.
I want to add a few things here. First of all, the reason why I told the whole story was because Maru asked for the history. So I gave the historical context, not as an answer to the question. But anyway, I think what is more important here is not where the binaries or how the binaries are distributed, but how the packaging is done. Because of the way Federation is built and distributed, I think most people are likely going to use Federation as the Docker image that we are going to ship than the individual binaries. So it really doesn't matter whether the binary is a single binary or two binaries or like 5 binaries. What really matters is how many Docker images we are going to ship with all the binaries in there.
That's a fair point. I was kind of wondering whether it mattered. I mean, we want to ship a single image no matter what. Why would someone use the binaries independently, given that you have to host on Kube? I don't know. So maybe it doesn't matter. Are there reasons? What's the advantage of having separate binaries versus a single binary if we distribute as an image anyway, a single image?
Yeah.
If there isn't one, then I would say separate binaries. That makes more sense.
Having separate binaries, there are pros and cons. Sorry, I'm not trying to throw a wrench in everything. But having 2 separate binaries increases the distribution size for sure.
Oh, right. So we have a bigger image, in other words.
Yeah.
And that when you say like bigger, you were talking about gigabytes before.
No.
Is that
hundreds of megabytes?
Hundreds of megabytes. Okay, so. Never mind. On that basis alone, I think we should go with a single binary, just because that means that our image is going to be hundreds of megabytes less, and I think that's a win no matter what. So,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to suggest we move on. If that does become a contentious issue, i.e., if we want to change whatever we're doing at the moment, we can discuss that. It doesn't sound like there's any great disagreement there. So 1.8 tasks, I wasn't aware of anything that we needed to worry about there. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the documentations is in, the PRs are in. I'm not aware of anything that needs any love there. Does anyone disagree with that? Okay, testing and CI updates. I think there was a bit of a quota issue this week. I believe that's all resolved. Anything else to talk about there? Madhu, I think you were the most actively involved in that.
Sorry, I missed that part. Can you please repeat that? I got distracted. Sorry.
I say our CI last due to a quota issue, which I believe was resolved yesterday. Is there anything else worth talking about there, or should we move on?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, Madhu, you go first.
Okay. So there's only a small summary to add here. So it turns out every time we create a new project for new release, we need more quota than usual Kubernetes tests for the GCP project. Shashi made a very good point to document the quota requirements, but honestly, I don't really have the numbers. I usually do it ad hoc. So I opened an internal bug for people in the Google internal testing for a team who create these projects to actually copy over the configuration. It was actually Christian's suggestion. So we opened an internal issue for the testing for a team to just copy over the configuration from one of the main Federation projects. So I did that, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. The other thing is I have a cleaner script that runs once a day on my machine. It's basically a cron job. So this cleans up any leaked tasks. So there was some problem with that, and it did not properly clean up resources since Wednesday. So we had some leaks. We cleaned it up yesterday, fixed the script, and it's working fine. So that's that. That's it.
So if somebody else needs to set up a new job, they know what to do, and hopefully they can get it right next time.
Yeah. The only thing is quota thing. There is no way to automate the quota increase request. Somebody has to do it manually because it's a web form that should be filled in Cloud Console. So somebody has to do that manually.
Okay, and that currently is limited to Google people, right? Because that's a Google project.
Yeah.
And
So that's all documented and we know what to do next time. That should be fine.
Yeah.
And how do we get that? Is it what is the plan to get that outside of Google? Is this something that we put on Nprod or SIG testing? Sorry. How do we reduce? How do we remove the Google or only dependency here?
Google only? I don't think it's possible here.
All right.
Unfortunately, this only happens whenever we create a new project, and the new projects are created when we cut a new release.
I mean, is this something? Sorry, is this something that test infra can become responsible for, so that whoever's on call can respond to like people in the community who aren't Googlers?
Yes, and we have opened the issue that we opened internally is against test infra. Test infra has taken the responsibility of creating even the Federation projects for Federation testing every release. So it should be their responsibility to also set the quotas properly. I have filed the issue to that against their label, and they're aware of it. So yes.
Yeah, Madhu, feel free to forward this to me also, and I'll see what I can do to escalate that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's my understanding is that it's an issue across the whole of Kubernetes. All of the jobs, they're all currently run in projects that are owned by Google and that can only have quota adjusted by Google. So yeah, it's not really a Federation specific issue. As far as I see. Cool. There's that one PR that is still looking for reviewers, if anyone can do that.
Quick question.
We really do need some.
Quick question about that PR or anything else remaining pending against KK. What's our policy with respect to merging it? Do we intend to have a hard end date on major merges to KK, and then we'll be cutting it over to the new repo, or I don't know. I don't know if we had a plan. If we did, I've forgotten it.
I think Irfan put a plan to proposals was. Irfan, are you here? Can you talk to that?
Yes. So yeah, the plan that I have put out is that, and in the previous Federation Sync also this was discussed, that only needed or necessary commits, for example, bug fixes or very small pending stuff which might be like a overspill or something from already running cycles, should be merged into KK, and there should be some mechanism where we should be able to pull in those commits into the ongoing work of the new repo. So as of now, I think that should be it, right? If somebody else has some objections or comments to it.
So if that's true, I would hope that, I mean, we can continue reviewing a big PR like the one linked to and sort of get it to a final state, but we would hold off on merging it and actually transition to the other repo before we commit it.
We can do that.
I don't have a problem with that philosophically. I just wouldn't want to introduce kind of indefinite delays for no obvious value. So I don't want to hold up.
My suggestion, Maru, on the other hand, is that we do review the existing PR and finalize it or put it in a good shape where it can be merged to KK itself. And the mechanism I'm talking about is then pulling in these new commits, which are post whatever we might have already pulled into Federation repo can be done later. Means at any given point of time, both will be in sync.
I guess like unless we're starting from this new state of KK with a major change, like we have to cherry pick and we have to worry about changed paths and all kinds of stuff. And who's going to do that?
I think I did sign up for that, right?
Okay.
That's part of the matter.
I mean, I guess for me, your effort, I'm not sure anybody's effort is well spent on mechanical things if we could avoid them.
No,
so.
I am trying to automate that, and until only changing
like between how much
concerned. Yeah, Quinton, you're saying something.
So it's a balancing act between how much work is that involved, and Irfan one seems to understand what work's involved, and two has signed up to do it, versus the downside of not being able to merge anything until we're all like moved across, which, for example, is holding up Azure at the moment. And it's not clear to me where the right balance is. It's not obvious to me that we should just freeze everything. It seems like the person doing the migration can essentially, tell us what they think should be done and do it, which is where we are today. Okay. Irfan, do you want to give us a general update on where we are with the move out of the repo?
Yeah, so repo was created last week, and post that, I have just been able to, so the 3 people who have actually signed up for working on it, where I'm working on it, Maru has signed up that he'll 100% support it, and Shashi, maybe not 100%, but would be supporting it for whatever he can come in. What we have done so far is most of the work is not really committed in, but the repo is sort of in sync with a particular date with whatever code is there in KK. And I and Maru last couple of days have been trying to work on the vendor code, figuring out the vendoring strategy. Then the next step is trying to figure out the way of generating the API code or using the API code and the make files. And Shashi would, as far as I understand, would be focusing on the test infra related work, where migrating the jobs or replicating the jobs which are necessary for the testing of it. So there isn't much to update as of now, but probably by next sync meeting we would have a chunk of work completed. That's what we are hoping.
So from my side,
that sounds great. That was my next question.
Yeah, Maru can update something, and Quinton, you are saying something. Sorry for interrupt.
Sorry, go ahead, Quentin.
Carry on, Maru. No, I was going to say my only question was 2 weeks ago we sort of guesstimated at a month elapsed time to kind of have this complete, or at least substantially complete, and it sounds like we're on track for that. So in 2 weeks' time we'll presumably have all the code moved across, all the vendoring stuff resolved, and hopefully be able to kind of not have these discussions about whether to accept. PRs into the old repo anymore because we can accept them into the new one.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't going to be an endless thing. It's just there is a certain amount of risk involved right now because first step is vendoring. The second step is, getting stuff building, which will probably include infrastructure for generating code, building the binaries, building the images, and then at that point we'll be able to run tests. And once we can run tests, then I think we could probably reasonably cut over. The generating code is a little bit complicated because there's some code in Kube that is not committed, is generated, and we'll have to actually generate that code that's Kube API server specific as part of our build process. That to me suggests that probably the most immediate requirement once we're cut over to the new repo will be following on the work of the working group, creating a Federation specific API that doesn't include it doesn't just pull in Kube and use that. It actually has Federation specific resources and a Federation specific API server. And the reason being that Kubernetes is really the repo isn't designed to be consumed in the way we're consuming it out of tree. I don't expect that will change because we're not intending to use that long term. So in the short term, we'll jump through some build hoops to kind of get parity, and then hopefully we'll be able to throw away that ugliness when we move to our own server. Yeah, that's it from me.
Cool. Sounds good. Shall we move on? We've got 50. So there was the renaming of the SIG, which Jesse volunteered to do, I guess about a month ago. Does anyone know what the status is there?
I'll be taking that over. I did a few of these name changes,
Okay.
but not all of them. So over the next week or so.
Okay, is Jesse no longer involved with this group?
No, Jesse's just out on personal leave for the next probably another 2-3 weeks.
Oh. Okay. Cool. I undertook this item to reach out to the other groups working on multi-cluster things, which I haven't done yet, but I can do that in the coming 2 weeks.
I have one item to add to the agenda too.
Sure. Go ahead.
We have 7 people on the build cop rotation. And I think what 4 of them are Googlers. I'm wondering if we can have, I noticed just in this meeting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 14 people who are in this meeting, it seems like regularly. Is there more people who we can have on the build cop rotation? Sort of looking for volunteers?
Yeah, I would certainly support that.
This is Dan.
So
I'm happy to help if I can. Obviously, I'd need to know, go through the instructions with someone. But.
Yeah, I mean, there would definitely be ramp up involved, but I think we could use more. What I've noticed is like once you get around like 12 people, it feels really good for everybody. But 8 is, 7 is a lot, and especially when half of it's sort of from one team or one organization. So Dan, that's great. Thank you.
So just to clarify, so there's 2 potential changes here. The one is the size of the rotation, and the other one is the weight of Google people on that rotation. So which of the 2 are we trying to rotation bigger and reduce the number of Google people, or just one of those 2?
Well, I think if you make the rotation bigger, then the impact on one organization, if it's anybody, does get smaller.
Yeah. There's a flip side, which is that if you only do this stuff once a quarter, you tend to get pretty bad at it. From my experience with SRE, so I guess we just need to balance those. I guess 12 over a 12-week cycle is not the end of the world, but it seems like the upper end of that range that we would want to target. The problem I've seen is that if you do this stuff not frequently enough, every time you do it, the tools have changed, and it's very difficult.
I'm not worried that we're near that danger zone yet. I almost feel like we can burn that bridge when we get there, but I think that right now it's still pretty impactful.
Okay, so we have 7 people now. We're aiming to increase that to 12.
I think that's a good goal.
Remove any people that are currently also want to remove some of the people. That was a question for you, Mike.
I'd rather, like, I mean, I kind of just dropped this out of nowhere right now in this meeting just because I'm watching and just sort of looking at the load overall. So I don't want to remove anybody from it like this week. It's not really something that's on my, I think that would be a little abrupt, but I feel like we should probably try to, I would rather that we add more folks to the rotation and get more understanding of, spread throughout the community than pull people from it first. But I feel like it's something that we should start, looking at. So having Dan go, Dan, that's great. But I think we need to have more folks. I'll probably reach out to Paul Morey also, because I know that he's interested in this, and see if Red Hat can also find people to help. Especially because there's still pieces of this infrastructure that are very still Google specific.
Yeah.
I think long-term strategy, we want to get away from having everything just be GCP and have something that's cluster agnostic that does the bulk of the testing, and then have integration tests for GCP and AWS. And hopefully that'll reduce the burden, because the GCP or AWS specific stuff can be handled by experts rather than just a general crew.
Yeah. But I think that's longer. That's like post core, out of core, probably. Maru, do you agree with that?
Yeah, that I said long term, I hope.
Yeah. So I think in the shorter term, though.
Sorry, carry on, Mike.
No, so this is just for now. Let's think about maybe increasing the build comp rotation. I found if we target 12, let's see where we go. If it ends up 10, I don't think anybody will be crying. I think that'll still be an improvement. And if you can add a comment maybe on the doc and plus Paul Morey and me, that would be great. And I can start talking to Paul also.
Okay, so can we make you point person for that at the moment? Like talking to people?
I can be the point person for that. That's fine.
Cool.
While we are at it, I also want to add one more point. Communication has been a problem right now. I don't know, Christian is complaining now, but it so happens every time that when something breaks, because he's one of the SIG leads, people ping him, and person who is on call is either not around or something, and he ends up doing like the initial work. The major problem here is people outside our team, as in outside our SIG, don't know who our on-call is or where our on-call rotation list is. So Nikhil tried a little bit to set this up, but things did not work out at the time he was working on this. There was no infrastructure to do it or something like that. If someone else can take this over and set up a page where we actually publish who our on-call is every week, that would be great. And we should probably communicate that to SIG testing and like anywhere else, like Kubernetes dev or somewhere else, so that people know whom to actually contact when something breaks.
Yeah, I agree. That makes perfect sense. As before we get too fancy, we can just put a link from our SIG page to these are the dates and these are the people, and then every time anybody gets interrupted by somebody saying fix this thing, you just send them a link to that page, and that should at least put out the fire for now. We can get fancier than that in the future, but that seems to fulfill the requirement. My suggestion would be, once we put this new list of 12 people together, we put them on that page and use that as the Kickstarter for that, unless somebody wants to do it before then.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, cool. We have 7.5 minutes left, hopefully up here. So as I promised, that's wrong. Yes, so I promised to go through all of the issues that are tagged with our SIG label and just go and prioritize them and assign them and do whatever needs to be done. Basically what I did was I went through everything. There are 164 total issues, kind of trickle in somewhere around about 5 per week. And what I've been doing is just clearing the backlog. So everything at the moment is either assigned or prioritized. And I didn't go prioritizing things that are already assigned to other people. I can do that as a second pass. And I didn't assign things that were prioritized. So my thinking was either the people who are currently assigned to have issues assigned to them probably have the best context and can either prioritize those issues or unassign themselves from them, in which case they will show up in the unassigned list and I can prioritize them.
So two things. So we should probably have a date associated with that when we would expect that to get done by. It sounds like a great idea, but I also noticed that, you know, if we just say this is a good idea, it can kind of dangle. Do you want to say you want that done?
Yeah, we
maybe
decided that 2 weeks ago and I did it.
Oh, great. But I mean, no, I think you did your side, but are you still waiting for other people to unassign themselves or prioritize themselves?
No, that was what I was suggesting. That if you have things assigned to you, you should either prioritize them or unassign them, and that we can put on the expected by the next meeting deadline. Not done by then, I will just do.
Okay.
But I guess more interestingly is we have currently, according to my prioritization, 16 stuff we need to do now or failing tests. We have about 75 that I believe are things that we need to resolve for GA. And then all the remainder of the 164 issues are things that are either on the backlog or I've used the priority labels that exist in GitHub. So they're either, you know, nice to have backlog stuff or they are important in the long term, but if you want to have a look at them and agree or disagree with my prioritization, you can just click on those links over there. So we just add an action item here saying, please either prioritize or unassign yourself from issues before the next meeting.
Can we also go back to item D before we go on to the expectations by next meeting? Because I read the notes and I'm not sure it matched up with what we just said. Is Madhu responsible for communicating our on-call rotation better, or like how did that end up?
I think I actually had it under C. No, I don't think he.
You had it under C, but I added it as a separate thing because it felt different to me. So I just wanted to know. I still was confused over what the actual owner and what the outcome was.
So you are the point person at the moment for figuring out or talking to people to try and compose that target group of 12.
Yep.
And then either you can publish that on a page saying, here's the 12 and this is the rotation, or you can appoint or ask someone else to do that.
So I guess my question is that still, if we have that page, Madhu, does that still address the problem though, where people find issues and then don't know where to find the on-call page or where to go next? Do they end up pinging Quentin instead, or?
So there are multiple things here, right? One, we need to let's say we have a static page. We need to make sure that we update this page every time we update the rotation and ensure that we put the names and the dates properly so that people know who is on the rotation. The second thing is we need to communicate this with other SIGs. Maybe not many SIGs, but at least SIG testing and Kubernetes dev. There's more work than just static page.
So if we're needing to communicate this to this wider audience, is there any chance we could just write on the existing on-call page that already lists like a build cop, test infra, that sort of thing?
That was our hope. That was Nikhil's hope as well when he started this whole thing. But for some reason we could not get that done. There was some problem. I don't remember the details. I wish Nikhil was here. But yes, if you can do that, that would be great.
I mean, it just seems like something common infrastructure, like we really should just have one page for the entire like community where
like a who do I notify?
Yeah, who do I go to? Who do I talk to? Because there's always coordination issues constantly.
So I'm going to just assign this to Nikhil, who has the context of maybe what needed to be done and didn't happen, and we'll talk to him when he comes back.
Great. If he can either wrap it up or hand it over to somebody else with context, that would be perfect. All right, we have a very small number of seconds left. I will clean up, what we decided we would have done by the next meeting from the notes above. I just wanted, so what's in front of us now under item 7 is what last week we said we would, the meeting a few weeks back, we decided we will have done by, so we kind of are getting towards a GA plan for Federation. We're not quite there yet, but we're working on it. Getting the core repo, we're on track there. Prototype API server, we're pretty much on track. Issue triage review, we did. What else have we got here? Shashi migration, I don't think we're going to have time to get an update, but it seems like that's going ahead. The submit queue is unblocked for now, and the work Shashi's doing should make that more permanent. Move out a repo, we've got that, and there was an incompatibility with 1.8. Nikhil was going to look into, but he's away, so maybe he can give us an update next time. Is he on vacation at the moment or out of office?
No, he's just out of office.
Anyway, we will have
not on vacation, out of office.
Cool. All right. I'll clean up the notes, distribute them on the mailing list, and 2 weeks time.
Thanks, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.